The acceptance letter arrived on a quiet afternoon, slipped halfway under the front door like it was unsure whether it belonged inside our house. I picked it up slowly, my fingers trembling before I even read my name. When I finally did, my heart leapt so hard it hurt. I had been accepted, not just anywhere, but into the program I had dreamed about for years. For a moment I stood there frozen, imagining what came next, my parents smiling, my mother hugging me, my father nodding with that rare look of pride. I imagined us celebrating something that felt bigger than all of us. That evening, I waited until dinner was over. I didn't want to ruin the meal or seem ungrateful. I wanted to do this the right way. I sat across from them at the table, the letter folded neatly in my hands like a fragile promise. My voice shook when I began, not because I doubted myself, but because I cared deeply about what they would say. I got accepted, I said, sliding the letter forward. I worked really hard for this. My mother glanced at it briefly. My father picked it up, scanned it quickly, and set it down as if it were nothing more than a grocery receipt. There was no smile, no congratulations, just silence. I explained the tuition next, carefully, respectfully. I told them I planned to work part-time, that I had already applied for scholarships, that I wasn't asking for everything, just some help to get started. I even offered to pay them back. I had rehearsed every word in my head, making sure none of it sounded entitled. My father leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You need to be independent," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We didn't have anyone helping us when we were young." My mother nodded slowly. "This is how you learn responsibility." The words didn't land gently. They crashed. I waited for more. Surely this wasn't the end of the conversation. Surely they would suggest a loan, or a partial contribution, or even emotional support. But instead, my father added, "If we help you now, you'll always depend on us." That sentence hollowed me out. "I'm not trying to depend on you forever," I said, my throat tightening. "I just need help right now." My mother sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Life isn't easy, you need to understand that." I understood hardship. What I didn't understand was why it had to begin with abandonment. The conversation ended abruptly, like a door slammed shut. No compromise, no encouragement, just a final, quiet message: you're on your own. That night, I went to my room and stared at the walls for a long time. Everything felt unfamiliar, like I had been living in a house that was never truly mine. I packed a suitcase slowly, folding clothes with hands that felt numb. Every sound in the house felt louder: the ticking clock, the television in the living room, my own breathing. When I walked toward the door, neither of them stopped me. My mother didn't ask where I was going. My father didn't look up. I stood there for a moment, hoping stupidly that one of them would say my name. No one did. I stepped outside into the night, the air cold against my skin, the suitcase heavy in my hand. Fear wrapped around my chest, but underneath it was something sharper: heartbreak, not because they couldn't help, but because they wouldn't even try. As I walked away, I realized that asking for help had cost me more than money. It had shown me exactly where I stood. And in that painful clarity, something inside me shifted. If I had to survive alone, then I would. But I would never forget the night I learned that independence wasn't a choice. It was forced on me by the people who were supposed to stand beside me. The first year on my own felt less like living and more like surviving. Every morning began before sunrise, my alarm ringing in the dark while my body begged for rest. I worked at a small cafe near campus, tying my apron with stiff fingers and forcing a smile onto my face before the first customer walked in. By afternoon, I rushed to classes, my mind fighting to stay focused while exhaustion dragged at my thoughts. Nights were spent at another job or bent over textbooks, my eyes burning as I memorized chapters under weak, flickering lights. Hunger became a constant companion. I learned which days the campus events offered free food and which grocery items could stretch the longest. Some nights, dinner was just instant noodles. Other nights, it was nothing at all. I told myself it was temporary, that this was the price of independence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't independence I had chosen. It was necessity. I watched classmates live different lives. They talked casually about parents paying tuition, sending money, calling every week to check in. I nodded along, pretending I belonged in those conversations. When they invited me out, I often declined, blaming homework or work shifts instead of admitting I couldn't afford a coffee. Isolation wasn't just emotional. It was financial, social, and relentless. One night, overwhelmed and desperate, I called home. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I simply told my parents I was struggling. I said I was tired. I said I was scared. For a moment, there was silence on the line, and hope flickered painfully in my chest. Then my mother spoke. "This is how you become strong," she said. "We're doing you a favor." My father's voice followed, steady and distant. "You wanted this, you need to handle it." The call ended shortly after. I stared at my phone for a long time, feeling foolish for expecting comfort. Whatever part of me still believed they might step in finally went quiet. From that point on, something changed. I stopped waiting for help. I poured my energy into survival with a new intensity. I applied for every scholarship I could find, writing essays late into the night about perseverance and ambition, while my hands shook from fatigue. Rejection emails filled my inbox, each one stinging, each one threatening to break what little hope I had left. Then, finally, one acceptance came, then another, small amounts but enough to keep me going. There were still failures. Exams I barely passed, jobs I lost because my schedule couldn't stretch any further. Moments when I cried alone in bathroom stalls, my forehead pressed against cold tiles as I tried to breathe through the weight of everything. No one saw those moments. No one knew how close I came to giving up. Years passed like this, measured in semesters, paychecks, and survival milestones. I learned discipline because I had no safety net. I learned resilience because quitting wasn't an option. I learned how to endure silence, hunger, and loneliness without letting them define me. Graduation day arrived quietly. I sat among hundreds of students, listening to cheers from families that weren't mine. My name was called. I walked across the stage alone. No applause I recognized, no familiar faces, just me, holding a degree that represented every skipped meal, every sleepless night, every tear swallowed in silence. That evening, I walked home instead of celebrating. I placed my diploma on the table and stared at it for a long time. Pride and sadness twisted together in my chest. I had done it, but at a cost I never should have had to pay. Still, as I looked at that piece of paper, I realized something important. I wasn't weak for needing help, and I wasn't broken for surviving without it. I was becoming someone stronger than anyone had ever expected, even myself. 9 years passed faster than I ever imagined, yet every one of them carried the weight of the early struggles that shaped me. The hunger, the exhaustion, the silence, none of it disappeared. It transformed into discipline, focus, and an unshakable work ethic. I built my life carefully, brick by brick, because I knew what it felt like to have nothing to fall back on. There was no safety net beneath me, so failure was never an option. By the time I reached my 30s, my life looked stable from the outside. I had a career I was proud of, a modest but comfortable home, and the kind of financial security I once believed was impossible. I paid my bills without anxiety. I slept through the night without worrying about rent. I had earned respect in my field, not through connections or favors, but through persistence and skill. Every achievement carried a quiet satisfaction, because I knew exactly how much it had cost me to get there. I rarely thought about my parents anymore, not with anger, at least. The pain had dulled over time, settling into something distant and unresolved. We spoke occasionally, usually during holidays, exchanging polite words that avoided the past entirely. There were no deep conversations, no emotional closeness, just distance wrapped in civility. Then one evening, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. The name on the screen pulled me back years in an instant. When I finally did, my mother's voice sounded unfamiliar, softer, uncertain. She asked how I was, lingering on the question longer than usual. I answered politely, cautiously, sensing something beneath her words. After a pause, she explained, my parents were struggling. Medical expenses had piled up. Savings were nearly gone. The confidence that once defined them had been replaced by worry. When my father came on the line, his voice lacked the firmness I remembered. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. We were wondering. He said, clearing his throat, if you could help us for a while. The room felt suddenly very quiet. As they spoke, memories flooded my mind the night I packed my suitcase, the empty refrigerator, the graduation ceremony where no one cheered for me. I remembered the phrase, be independent, echoing like a rule carved in stone. The irony was sharp enough to hurt. They talked about family, about how parents and children should support one another, about how life had become harder than they expected. I listened without interrupting, my face calm, my heart steady. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel joy. I felt clarity. When they finally stopped talking, there was a long pause. I knew they were waiting for reassurance, maybe even gratitude for being asked. Instead, I took a breath. I've been independent for a long time. I said quietly I had to be. They didn't respond immediately. I could almost hear them processing the shift, the realization that the power dynamic had changed. I wasn't the anxious student asking for help anymore. I was someone who had survived without them and succeeded anyway. For the first time, they weren't speaking from authority. They were asking. I didn't give them an answer right away. I told them I needed time to think. When the call ended, I sat in silence, staring at the wall. The younger version of me, the one who had been told to figure it out alone, stood vividly in my memory. That night, I understood something deeply. Success wasn't just about money or stability. It was about standing in the very place where I had once been powerless and realizing that I now had a choice. And that choice belonged entirely to me. I took a few days before calling them back, not out of cruelty, but because I needed clarity. For most of my life, decisions had been made for me, by circumstances, by necessity, by people who believed toughness was love. This time, I wanted my response to come from calm, not from old wounds. When I finally called, both my parents were on the line. I could hear the tension in their breathing, the unspoken hope that I would say yes quickly and without hesitation. For a moment, I almost felt like that student again, sitting at the dinner table with folded hands and a heart full of fear. But the feeling passed. I've thought about what you asked. I began. My voice was steady. I reminded them, gently but clearly, of the night I asked for help with tuition. I spoke about the rejection, the silence, the way independence had been presented not as guidance, but as a wall. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse them of cruelty. I simply described the truth as I had lived it. I didn't choose to struggle alone. I said I was forced to, and I survived because I had no other option. There was silence on the line, heavy and uncomfortable. I imagined them sitting there, finally hearing the cost of their decision, without the shield of pride. I'm not angry anymore, I continued, but I learned something important back then. Independence without compassion creates distance, and distance changes relationships. I told them I could offer limited help, not as repayment, not out of guilt, and not because I owed them. I explained my boundaries clearly, calmly, without apology. Help would come with respect, transparency, and honesty. Or it wouldn't come at all. My mother's voice cracked when she spoke. We thought we were making you strong. You did, I replied. But strength came from survival, not support. That was the moment everything shifted, not because they apologized, though their regret was obvious, but because I finally felt heard. I wasn't seeking validation anymore. I had already given it to myself. After the call ended, I sat by the window, watching the city lights glow against the dark sky. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying unfinished business in my chest. The past no longer controlled me. It informed me, but it didn't own me. The sweetest revenge wasn't denying them help. It wasn't watching them struggle the way I once had. It was standing in my truth without bitterness. It was choosing compassion without sacrificing self-respect. It was proving, to them and to myself, that independence could exist alongside boundaries. I had built my life from nothing. I had earned every ounce of stability I now stood on, and I no longer needed my parents' approval to feel whole. As I turned away from the window, I smiled softly, not because I had won against them, but because I had finally won for myself. Independence had once been forced on me as a lesson. Now it was my strength, and this time I chose it freely,